So next we're going to have Professor Niall Ó Dochartaigh from the School of Political Science and Sociology at NUI Galway. After spending his early years in academia researching Derry and the civil rights movement, he turned to the more broad topics of conflict, negotiation, and peace processes. His 2021 book, Deniable Contact, Back-Channel Negotiations in Northern Ireland, provided the first full-length study of the secret negotiations in the Northern Irish peace process and challenges conventional notions about conflict in the area. I also believe Deniable Contact we also have for purchase today here at BC. His talk today is going to be entitled Bloody Sunday and the Saville Inquiry Between Politics and the Law.
Thank you, Rachel, for that introduction, and thank you very much to Guy Biner and Rob Savage and Boston College Irish Studies for organising this. It actually prompted us in NUI Galway to organise an event in January on the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. When I heard that Boston College was doing something, I thought it would just be really shocking and shameful if an Irish university didn't do something. So I'm grateful to them for that as well, for kind of sparking off greater activity on our side of the Atlantic. Bloody Sunday was the outcome of a high-level military decision to stage a major confrontational operation in Derry with an aggressive combat regiment on a day when the danger to civilians was extremely high. That decision was made in the face of opposition by army and police commanders based in Derry, who proposed a more conciliatory approach. The Saville Inquiry into Bloody Sunday, which reported in 2010, was thorough, extraordinarily thorough and comprehensive, and its findings were, with some reservations, warmly welcomed by survivors, relatives, and campaigners. But the inquiry allocated to responsibility to soldiers at low levels of the chain of command and attributed little significance to high-level decision-making. The effect was to insulate higher levels of the military and the state from blame. Over the next 30 minutes, I'll outline the struggle to shape security policy in Derry in the days before Bloody Sunday and on the day itself, and explain why this dangerously confrontational operation was planned. I will look then at the way in which the Saville Inquiry report dealt with evidence of these struggles. I'll conclude with a brief explanation of why Saville attributed so little significance to high-level divisions over policy and located responsibility so far down the chain of command. In the months prior to Bloody Sunday, security force commanders in Derry sought to limit repression in order to slow the deterioration in relations with the nationalist majority in the city. A key driver of this approach was Chief Superintendent Frank Lagan, commander of the police in the city. Lagan is pictured here in the Lower Falls in West Belfast in October 1969, where he's leading the first joint police army patrol in this nationalist Republican area, the first patrol after the police had been essentially expelled from this and other predominantly nationalist areas. So Lagan was the commander in this cockpit of conflict in Belfast, and he worked very closely with reform-minded British officials and with British Army commanders in Belfast to take a conciliatory approach that was supportive of the reforms that the British government initially imposed on the Unionist government in Northern Ireland. So this Lagan at the front with his swagger stick. So Lagan was himself a Catholic. He had gone to St. Colum's College in Derry, where Seamus Dean went, and John Hume, and so many others. And he had strong links to the Catholic community in the city. And so when he was posted there in 1970, it was, I think, a deliberate move to put someone in the city who would take a conciliatory approach. So he was also, in the weeks and months before the Bloody Sunday March, secretly in contact with Bridget Bond, who was the chair of the Derry branch of the Civil Rights Association and one of the lead organisers of the march. So he had these back-channel links that stretched to her, and beyond her to the official Republican movement, which at that time was still engaged in an armed campaign of the official IRA. When the Civil Rights Association announced that they would march in Derry, Frank Lagan proposed to the commander of British troops in Derry, Brigadier Pat McClellan, that they allow the march to proceed to the city centre, despite the fact that it was banned, in the interest of reducing the risks of violent confrontation. Brigadier McClellan reported this to his immediate superior, General Robert Ford, Commander Land Forces, the officer in overall command of operations in Northern Ireland, so the top operational commander in the north. And McClellan, I think, suspecting this was not going to get a favourable reception from Robert Ford, gave Lagan's suggestion an ambiguous endorsement, but he certainly didn't dismiss it. And on balance, he was endorsing it, but weakly. Now, General Ford was more enthusiastic about repression than many other senior officers serving in Northern Ireland. This is General Ford, pictured on the left, and actually he's a much more kind of rosy-cheeked, he's not this angular figure presented in the film Sunday yesterday. He doesn't look as menacing or as ominous as the figure who portrayed him. So I'm going to give you a few quotes from General Robert Ford that indicate his orientation. He said in a really important interview that he gave to Desmond Hamill for a book called Pig in the Middle about the British Army in an interview that took place in the early 1980s and is incredibly revealing because Bloody Sunday seemed to be in the past. And British officers at that point spoke freely about it, much more freely than they would do at the Saville Inquiry. So this is the only insight we have into this high-level decision-making really comes from these 1984 interviews, or the most important. He says there was a lot of pressure from Stormont to take tough action, and I agreed with that. That's a reference to the Unionist government of Northern Ireland. But the Unionist government of Northern Ireland there was no representation from the minority in it. It constantly pressured the British state to be tougher, to shoot people more, to shoot rioters. There's a constant source of pressure. The British government, by and large, offers some resistance to this. Ford is saying, I actually agreed with that pressure. I was, And then, as those of you who saw the film Sunday yesterday will have heard, he wrote a memo a couple of weeks before Bloody Sunday in which he wrote, I am coming to the conclusion that the minimum force necessary to achieve a restoration of law and order is to shoot selected ringleaders amongst the Derry young hooligans, the term the army used for rioters, young Catholic rioters in the city. So that's him contemplating action that, as was pointed out in the Saville Inquiry, was illegal, was contrary to the guidance that was issued to soldiers. That one Foreign Office official testifying to the Saville Inquiry was asked what he thought about this suggestion, and he said I think he referred to Frank Steele, the MI6 officer who was advising William Whitelaw at the time. He said if Steele had heard of it, he would have taken him aside and said, are you mad? So that this was, quite an extreme view within the state apparatus at the time. Now, that's not to say that he then planned that rioters would be shot on Bloody Sunday, but it puts him well to the right of many other officers. And his views are shared by Derek Wilford, who is, Ford is at the top of the pyramid. He's at the top of the operational pyramid in Northern Ireland, although there is General Harry Tuzo has a senior political role in the army in Northern Ireland. And then right at the bottom, Lieutenant Colonel Derek Wilford, who commanded the troops who were sent into the Bogside on Bloody Sunday, shared those views. And Wilford said many years later, I think in an interview with the renowned BBC journalist Peter Taylor, he says, we were an outside battalion brought in, but I don't think the RUC, that is the police, and the brigade that were in Londonderry were actually very much on side. They were not at all happy about what we were being asked to do. I just felt that there was a pacifist sort of attitude. So both Wilford, who's going in on the ground, Ford, who's at the very top of this pyramid, they both feel things are too soft in Derry, things need to be harsher. Now, so Ford was of the view that the army had been too restrained and too passive in Derry specifically, that while it had become much more aggressive across the north after internment, Derry remained this kind of local site of restraint, limited restraint. The army had killed several civilians in the city already. It didn't feel like a restraint to a lot of local people, but compared to what was going on elsewhere in Belfast, this remained a last sort of a site of relative restraint. And increasingly, others within the army were dissatisfied with this. So then, into this context of dissatisfaction with the softness of Derry, General Ford gets a suggestion from his army commander in Derry saying, well, maybe we should just let this ban march go ahead and not do anything in the interests of preventing an escalation of violence. Ford responded quickly. Without replying to McClellan, without consulting higher authority, without getting authorization from anywhere else, he phoned Brigadier Frank Kitson, who commanded British troops in Belfast, where the approach was much harsher. He said he needed to use the parachute regiment for the day of the march in Derry. So in his immediate response he gets a suggestion from the commanders in Derry saying, look, can we take we're thinking of a super soft approach on the day because otherwise it might spark violence. So he immediately makes a phone call to Frank Kitson. He says, can you give me the paras? I want to send them in Derry on Bloody Sunday. On the day of the march. A couple of months before this, the paras had shot several civilians dead in Ballymurphy in circumstances which we now know were unjustified. But no sanctions had been taken against them. So they had a very recent record of killing significant numbers of civilians in disputed circumstances. The next day, Ford phoned McClellan. He told him the paras were going to be deployed on the day of the march. And this is in McClellan's words in giving testimony to the inquiry, Ford said that he had decided to use the occasion to arrest as many hooligans as possible and spoke of arresting 300 to 400 people. Now, Derry had experienced rioting for the previous 2 years. The largest number ever arrested in the city in an arrest operation by troops was 27, okay? And that was extraordinary. 10 was a big haul if you sent troops in to grab people. Now, it's 300, 400 was impossible. The local commander said, we don't even have anywhere to put them. It's unfeasible. They didn't say that to General Ford. They just said, we're going to change this to as many as possible. So that's what's in the operational orders. But it gives a sense of the scale on which he's thinking, I want the hardest combat regiment that we have who've been killing civilians in Belfast. I want them to go in and do something the city has never seen before. So in direct response to a suggestion to do everything possible to avoid confrontation, he had ordered an arrest operation on a scale the city had never been seen before on a day when thousands of civilians would be on the streets. As I indicated, the initiative was taken without any policy decision or any attempt to secure political endorsement in advance, despite the fact that this ostensibly operational decision effectively changed the state-mandated policy in Derry. So that quite recently, the British government had endorsed the level of limited restraint that was taking place in the city. Ford met McClellan soon after to discuss the plan. And McClellan described this meeting in his statement to the Saville Inquiry. So Ford actually phoned McClellan and he said, this is what you're going to do. You're going to arrest hundreds of people. You're going to send the paras in. He phoned him up in the evening and he said, I want you to draw up those operational plans and I want them on my desk in the morning. So it's like, it's the evening time now. you're going to stage the biggest confrontation the city has ever seen, and you're going to plan it out before breakfast. And McClellan says, so we worked through the night to write that plan. So there's a clear sense of really intense pressure and the displeasure of the senior commander being expressed. It looks like, how dare you suggest that we go so soft. So McClellan described, he then flies by helicopter to meet Ford, and he describes the meeting with Ford. I was given a direct order by General Ford to launch an arrest operation if the soldiers were attacked by the hooligans. He specifically allotted one para for the task. This was not a matter for debate. There was no discretion as far as I was concerned. He was asked about what the meeting, what kind of discussion they had. Was there back and forth? He said this was not a sort of debating association. It was what the army would call an orders group. He would say, this is what you are going to do. Boom, boom, boom. I think he made about 8 or 10 points. So essentially McClellan has been brought in and told what to do and essentially chastised for his softness. So it all suggests very intense pressure on McClellan from Ford, because the latter was deeply dissatisfied with the relative restraint being exercised by the army in Derry. In his statement to the Saville Inquiry, the Derry-based commanding officer of the Royal Anglians, so one of 2 senior British officers under McClellan's command in Derry, Colonel Roy Jackson, recalled how he thought his response when he heard about this planned operation. So Roy Jackson says, I just wondered who had thought out this deployment. It reflected a change of policy and emphasis on future operations in Londonderry. I think the key word there is policy. No permission has been sought or granted for a change in policy, but to the commander on the ground, or one of the commanders on the ground, this looks like policy has changed. So Ford has essentially made an intervention in policy through what, on the face of it, is a simple operational decision. You will use this regiment on this day, you will carry out this operation. And this is just an image of troops behind one of the barricades on the day. So the march presented General Ford with an opportunity to disrupt existing policy in Derry without having to secure a formal policy decision. The policy decisions that shaped the planning of the operation were also evident on the day of the march. The paras waiting behind the barricades, ready to go in, were in tune with General Ford's conception of a major confrontation. In brigade headquarters in Derry, Brigadier McClellan was, formally speaking, in charge of the operation on the day. Only he could order the troops to go in. And he was consulting throughout the day with Chief Superintendent Frank Lagan, the head of police in the city, who had brought this message that the civil rights leaders, that Bridget Bond had said the march would not attempt to go to the city centre, would not attempt to breach the barricades, they would turn away and in an attempt to avoid confrontation. So Brigadier McClellan held off giving the order for the paras to launch their arrest operation for so long that the paras contacted him to request orders to go in. When their request met with no success, they contacted a nearby unit and they asked them to ring brigade headquarters and say that rioting was ongoing. And now, by this time, rioting was dying out. And if the troops waited much longer, there would be no one left to arrest. That's why the paras start pushing. They see, actually, we're not going to be able to do our big, massive operation if McClellan doesn't give the order. And at this point, McClellan comes out, and both McClellan and Lagan testified to this. McClellan came out after that second call from the paras, and he said to Lagan, the paras want to go in. And Lagan says, for heaven's sake, hold them. at least until civilians and marchers are separated. But he's basically, Lagan is in there in these last moments trying to stop them being sent in. I think it's inescapable to me that the conclusion that McClellan and Lagan hoped that the opportunity might be there to simply hold off long enough that the order need never be given. Now, when McClellan did finally give the order, and I think McClellan is there, Ford is on the ground with the Parrys. He's actually come to Derry for the day. He's standing with them down at the barricades. McClellan is aware that if he doesn't give the order, he was told at this meeting, you are ordered to send them in if they attack the troops. So he finally gives the order, but it's tightly limited. He says basically, don't go into the bogside, just do a quick, loop in. It's clearly aimed at minimizing their impact. The Parrys disobeyed his orders by breaching the clear limits he had set. And as the Parrys surged forward into the bogside, General Ford, who had ordered this operation, was at the barricades, urging them on, shouting, and was captured, I think, by journalists, shouting, "Go on the Parrys, go and get them," in the moments in which they move forward. Just minutes after they were ordered in, McClellan sent another order saying, "Withdraw." So he lets them go in, he tries to make it as restrictive as possible, and then within minutes he's saying, "Right, get out again." But by that stage, they had started firing, and they continued firing afterwards. The actions of the Parrys fitted well with a plan for a major confrontation. It's unsurprising that attempts by McClellan to restrain them would be ignored by their commander, Derek Wilford. It really was just at odds with the whole ethos of the operation, which is a major confrontation. General Ford's presence at the barricades reinforced the understanding that the operation enjoyed his direct sanction. It was, in a sense, although only McClellan could give the order, it was his conception, it was his operation, and in a sense was directed against the policy of restraint associated with local commanders. In ignoring the limits set by McClellan, one might say that Wilford was being true to the spirit of the operation as originally conceived by General Ford. Ford's view of local commanders in Derry is captured in the testimony of one British officer who recalls meeting Ford that day, and Ford told him on the streets of Derry to this officer, he says, "That's the trouble with you in Londonderry. You aren't aggressive enough." And we have a telling second-hand account of his response to the shootings. Now, this is before he knows that they have killed 13 civilians. So, this is not sort of response to the killing of large numbers of civilians. Presumably, he assumed at that stage that at least some of those killed were members of the IRA. But this comes from a recording of a conversation between two army officers in the city shortly after the killing. So they're talking on the radio not long afterwards about what happened. And the Saville Inquiry confirmed. They authenticated the tape and they said this is genuine. Officer 1 on the tape says, "He was lapping it up." Who was? Ford. Was he? Yeah, he said it was the best thing he had seen for a long time. Interesting, is it not? Well done, First Parry, he said. Look at them, $24 million. So, again, a sense that the idea that shooting would break out doesn't seem to have been an unanticipated outcome. So he's not referring directly to exactly what happened. He knows there's been shooting, possibly knows people have been killed, but he knows it's turned into, something quite serious, and that is not that doesn't jar. He doesn't say, "Oh no, what's happened? That's terrible." It's like, yes, they've done the job. Now, this is not to say that he secretly planned the killings, but the news that people had been killed was clearly not viewed by him as a calamitous failure. So his remarks give the impression instead that they were at least an anticipated possibility of the operation. The Bloody Sunday Inquiry was the most extensive public inquiry in UK legal history, and the final report runs to 4,500 pages. The inquiry had a broad mandate to understand what happened, not to just take a narrow legal view of it, not just to say who might be prosecuted or who might not. In fact, prosecution was not part of the inquiry's mandate, but to understand what happened. And Saville spoke explicitly of a search for the truth. They were looking for the truth. Now, it's important to mention at this point one important limitation to the inquiry report. On the accounts of the soldiers who killed people and injured people, we still don't know what happened, because their evidence is not compatible with the injuries inflicted on people. It cannot be matched to the forensic evidence and any of the other evidence. And Christopher Clark, counsel to the Bloody Sunday Inquiry, after the end of all of the hearings, made a really kind of a devastating remark as he summed up what the evidence says. He said, "It has to be said that even after many days of evidence, the answer to even the first question, who shot them, is not on the soldiers' evidence in any way clear." So, in fact, the accounts of the soldiers do not match a single one of the killings they actually carried out. Not one soldier's account can be mapped onto an actual killing. So they're completely inaccurate. And their defense on the day, their defense team decided, and I thought this was a joke when I first heard it, that their defense would be that those descriptions were accurate, but that they must have killed other people whose bodies were spirited away, that they'd in fact killed many more than the 13 who had died. It's an extraordinary, but that was the way their defense team dealt with the fact that you couldn't actually, because the other conclusion is that they're lying. You know, that's the only other conclusion. So, in the final report, as I said, Saville allocated responsibility well down the chain of command, primarily to Colonel Derek Wilford, or Lieutenant Colonel Derek Wilford, commander of the Paras, and to some of the soldiers who carried out the shootings. The internal power struggle I've just outlined was not accorded any great significance by Saville in explaining the outcome of the Bloody Sunday operation. Part of the reason was that he drew a sharp distinction between operational decisions and political or policy-related decisions. So he treats military decision-making in relation to repression as a kind of depoliticized realm in which we can judge decisions simply on the basis of operational criteria. So the policy decisions are made elsewhere, the military is implementing them, and therefore their realm, there's no politics in there, that's outside. They're simply making operational decisions about how best to implement policies. So he treats it as this kind of depoliticized realm. So deep divisions and tensions within the military that were ultimately about different political visions and different conceptions of the relationship with the civilian population that were crucial to motivating action were marginalized in the analysis. I'm just going to look, and I'll finish up shortly, but before I do so, I'll look at one example of how Saville dealt with such divisions. A few days before the operation, a Derry-based officer, Peter Welsh, phoned an old friend of his who happened to be military assistant to the top figure in the British Army, the Chief of the General Staff, Lord Carver. Lord Carver was the British Army's liaison with the British government. So he's at the very top of that sort of interface between the political and military decision-making. And Peter Welsh phoned him up and said, can you, somehow express my concern, convey my concern about this planned operation in Derry? So it's really, it's kind of an irregular back-channel attempt to influence what's happening and really to moderate, to reduce the confrontational potential. He also expressed his opposition to the deployment of the parachute regiment to Brigadier McClellan, commander of troops in Derry. like other officers who made similar efforts at the time to change the shape of the operation, he was concerned to avert a major confrontation, and that's clear from his evidence. But like other officers, in making his case, he emphasised narrow technical points. And so when he spoke to Brigadier McClellan, he said his own troops would be a more appropriate arrest force than the paras. They knew the streets better. They understood the sort of rhythm of violence in the city. So he makes all these technical arguments. So in examining his evidence, the inquiry stripped his intervention of any political or policy dimension. So Saville wrote, "We believe that the primary concern expressed by Colonel Welsh to Brigadier McClellan was, as he indicated in his statement to this inquiry, that his own battalion did not have a greater role." And this, in fact, makes it sound as if he's piqued, he's vain. Why are my guys not doing this big job? So it certainly strips it of any. It's seen as some kind of internal rivalry between regiments. However, other comments to the inquiry by Peter Welsh indicate that this technical argument that he made was prompted by part of a broader concern to avert a major confrontation that ran against the grain of the policy of relative restraint in Derry. So Welsh also remarked in testimony, he said, "The paras had been trained as shock troops by Kitson. If there was anything nasty to do, they did it. He was disappointed that his battalion wouldn't be used because we were trying to do the best we could to get on with the Catholic population, and perhaps there was a feeling that the troublemakers were being dealt with in a tougher fashion in Belfast than in Derry." I mean, this to me is a clear statement. He wants his group to do it because then it's less likely to be that kind of massive confrontation that Ford clearly has in mind. So there is a politics, there is a policy struggle and division here. And for Saville, the question is just, well, did you behave appropriately according to your place in the command structure? So when he looks at Peter Welsh, when he sees Peter Welsh phoning an old friend to express his concern, his main question is, well, is this improper to, attempt to bypass a chain? So he looks at these officers and just says, well, did you do things by the book or not? So when he says, he just wanted his own troops to do it, he's kind of judging him innocent of any attempt to change the operation because that might be seen as improper. So Saville's verdict. So the inquiry report treated such evidence in a way that obscured the significance of the efforts by senior military officers in Derry to reduce the potential for confrontation on the day. The consequence of the Saville report's approach to evidence of internal struggle is that some of the most important decisions of decision-making are marginalised and depoliticised, reduced to narrow technical disputes and disagreements. The inquiry report of 2010 allocated responsibility to soldiers at low levels of the chain of command. It found that Lieutenant Colonel Derek Wilford, the officer in charge of one para, was largely at fault. Saville noted that Wilford either deliberately disobeyed his commander, Brigadier Patrick McClellan's order, or failed for no good reason to appreciate the clear limits on what he had been authorised to do. He should not have sent his soldiers into an unfamiliar area which he and they regarded as a dangerous area where they might come under attack from Republican paramilitaries, given the significant risk that people would be killed or injured by army gunfire. Of course, one might say the same of General Ford's original conception of the operation. Ford was mildly criticised for choosing the parachute regiment. In our view, his decision to use one para is open to criticism, but he did not know his decision would result in soldiers firing unjustifiably. The report adds that Ford had no reason to believe that the risk of the soldiers firing unjustifiably was such that it was inappropriate for that reason for him to use them for such an operation. Ford was thereby divested of responsibility for the events on the day. And I'll conclude with one final quote. Some years before the inquiry began its work, Lieutenant Colonel Wilford, then retired, told an interviewer, "If people start talking about apologising, then I think one has actually got to look at who was responsible for the decision to carry out the particular type of operation and to use the only troops capable of doing that, who, if you like, were battle-hardened troops who would take no nonsense." That the inquiry did not systematically pursue this seemingly obvious line of investigation has much to do with the model of power with which it worked. In separating the struggles to shape the operation that day from the wider political divisions over security policy, the inquiry was poorly positioned to penetrate beneath the narrow technical arguments and rationalizations deployed in these internal struggles. Consequently, it provides an account of events that was narrowly framed in terms of formal responsibilities, professional competence, and that marginalised the policy disagreements and manoeuvring that led to Bloody Sunday. In doing so, it pushed responsibility down the chain of command and insulated higher levels of the military and the state from blame. And thank you.